So let's progress our learning on and let's start thinking about flexibility training. And I suppose the key obvious thing to say is flexibility training is inextricably linked to the concept of stretching. And you can see immediately in the images I've got on the screen here that we are talking about a concept of stretching, but we're going to take it a little bit further than that. The other point I want to make to you is that me explaining these concepts to you as students is nowhere near good enough as a full experience of this learning. You have to experience these things. So I hope you're doing this in combination with kind of a practical space and your teacher taking you through these stretches and introducing you to them. I just want to give you the core understanding, but you must do these for real to understand them, to grasp the sort of fundamental concepts. So there's my lecture over. Let's first of all talk about the concept of static stretching. Static stretching. And the first thing I want you to realize is we've got an example of a static stretch here, almost like a yoga stretch in this sense, but we've got stretches happening here on the side, on the latissimus dorsi, for example, and even would be the glutes as well, and the hamstrings on one side of the body. But the thing to realize here is that this performer moves themselves into a position of stretch and then holds that stretch in a static position. Okay, so a couple of points I'd like you to really be able to describe this in detail. The first is that the stretch occurs just beyond point of resistance. Okay, so have a think about that a second. What does that mean? That means that you stretch to a point where you feel the resistance. I'll talk more about that concept in a second. And then you just push slightly further. So the stretch should be just beyond the point of resistance. Sometimes we call it comfortable discomfort, an interesting term, comfortable discomfort. But just beyond the point of resistance. I'll tell you about this resistance in a few seconds' time. Secondly, the holds think that this is a concept of time from the FIT principle. By the way, this inadvertently is a concept of intensity just beyond point of resistance because it's a percentage of range of motion. But the time factor is we want the holds from 10 seconds to 30 seconds. Now, often we use this default of 10-second hold, but really we could be holding the stretch for much longer than that, potentially. And this is a really interesting point, coming back to my very first point. I want to introduce you to the concept of a stretch reflex. Okay, so what I want you to think about here is that as I drew onto this drawing a moment ago, this latissimus dorsi under here, this is kind of stretching during this stretch, right? As this performer sort of curls over in this direction, this latissimus dorsi stretches and lengthens. Okay, and what it's going to do is it's going to keep lengthening until a point where it reaches what we call a critical point, and it performs what we call a stretch reflex. In other words, the muscle will automatically actually contract back inwards to prevent the performer stretching further. So think about that. It's actually a safety mechanism. So to prevent that latissimus dorsi from stretching further and further and further and further and further and ultimately getting damaged, we have this mechanism where when we're stretching a muscle to its fuller degree, the muscle itself, the agonist in this case, the antagonist, sorry, will actually contract back, and we call that the stretch reflex. And the point I want to make to you is that the stretch reflex decreases, okay, so it's kind of inhibited or switched off after 5 to 6 seconds. So the way I'd encourage you to think about this, let's say you're doing 10-second stretches. After half of that time, 5 seconds, you should be able to push that stretch slightly further because the stretch reflex is what we call inhibited, or it's reduced. So you actually go through a grade to stretch, and it's worth considering that. And the other point, I didn't mean to change to pink here actually, but the other point is about repetition. You must repeat those stretches. So you might think, well, if I'm in a warm-up, I'll just stretch the muscle once. But this is not necessarily about a warm-up, okay? This is about training for an increase in adaptation in your flexibility, to increase the to increase the elasticity of muscle and tendon, even skin around the joint. We must do repetitions. And of course, repetitions is a concept of time from the FIT principle. So that's our basic concept of static stretching. What I'd like to develop with you now is what we would call a concept of static active stretching. So it's still static stretching. Apologies. But we refer to it as static active stretching. And why is that? Well, it's because in this sense, the stretch is voluntary, or what we sometimes call unassisted. Voluntary or unassisted. So in other words, the performer themselves develops the stretch, and therefore it's active. You're actively producing the stretch yourself. So we sometimes say there is no external force, so nothing's pushing on us other than gravity. Nothing is pulling us like a Dynaband or one of those elastics which we've got over here, for example. There's no external force acting on us. And what we do is we contract the agonist to produce the stretch. So, remembering that muscles work in pairs, if we contract one of the pair of muscles, it actually stretches the other, and the one we contract is called the agonist. Okay, it's called the agonist, and therefore that produces the stretch. So the only thing we sort of use as a force in this sense is gravity. Gravity is often the implicating force which produces the static active stretch. Now on the static passive side, we have a slightly different model. Okay, so still a static stretch, but now it's passive. Something else is doing the work for us. And in this case, of course, we can say it's produced by an external force. And I've got two examples here. I've got the example of a partner forcing down, and I've got the example of a Dynaband being pulled against the leg to produce a stretch in the hamstring. So an external force is applied. That's often a partner, and as I said before, it can be a Dynaband. Now, I was going to go on here and talk about ballistic stretching within this session, but I'm going to actually stop recording in a moment and come back to that. I want to mention some advantages in green of static stretching. First of all, they're very accessible, and you probably know this. They're probably the first types of stretches you did at your sports club or at your primary school PE lesson. They're accessible. Everybody can kind of do them and get involved. They're still technical, which I'll come to in a second. And the other point is that they require little equipment. So in other words, these are something which pretty much everyone can do at zero cost. And by the way, they are effective. If done over a period of time, they are effective, but they are not as rapidly effective as some of our other methods, which I'll come to in a second. But there are actually some negatives to this methodology. As I said already, sometimes I struggle with this being a negative. They are technical stretches. You know, this has got a shape to it. Okay, this has got a shape to it, and if you don't get your alignment, in fact, let me put that word in there, if you don't get your alignment correct, you know, having your feet pointing in the right way, your spine aligned correctly, it can, if you do it too much, even be a little bit dangerous over a period of time. Not like one stretch, by the way, but, you know, you'd have to do a lot of stretching. But it does require that technique and that alignment of the body parts. And the other point, and this is not really a weakness of the method itself, but I'd also say it's poorly valued. It's like a bolt-on. You might have found this in your own sports clubs. Do lots of fitness development, do lots of continuous training or intervals or whatever it is that you do, circuit training, power training, plyometrics, and stretching is like, and we do some stretching, we bolt it on, and it's kind of poorly valued as a result, so people don't tend to get the full benefit out of it. So there are some advantages and disadvantages. We've talked about the protocols, we've talked about the equipment. I mean, a couple of things on equipment. Notice things like loose-fitting clothing. Loose clothing is really important. Clothing itself can, as you'll know if you've ever tried stretching, I don't know, in some tight jeans or something, loose clothing is absolutely essential for this kind of activity. Lots of people will use kind of lycra type clothing as well because of course it stretches. And I'd just like to come back to the point about technique. Technique is essential for good stretching, you know, and we see stretching being done really, really poorly in many, 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 many occasions. So technique is really important to get the correct movement. I'll be straight back when we'll talk about ballistic stretching. Thanks.